This is the Run Inclusive Campaigns training hosted by Some of Us. I will be your trainer for today. Just a quick background about me. My name is Toni Preston, and I'm a US senior campaigner here at Some of Us, where I lead our human rights and civil liberties campaign. I will also be assisted by my awesome colleagues, Tafatwa and Holly, who will be helping out with various aspects of this training. You probably see them waving on the screen. So that's a bit about us. So now I'm going to go into a background really quickly about who we are, like the organization that's Some of Us, just in case this may be your first time hearing about what we do. So Some of Us is a global campaigning organization of almost 90 million people that are committed to curbing the growing power of corporations. We are experts at disrupting consumer brands and showing people the underbelly of how they are run, inspiring millions of people to take collective action and fight for real world change. Since 2011, we have built a movement that wants to buy from, work for, and invest in companies that respect the environment, their workers, and the processes of democracy. Together, we've taken on everyone from major digital platforms like Facebook and Apple, workers' rights violators such as Procter & Gamble, and a far-right extremists like Breitbart News. And we've won many of our campaigns. So that's a bit about who we are, Some of Us, a bit about me as the trainer. And with that, we're now going to move into our community guidelines for today. So first things first, this session is recorded and closed caption is available. If you do not want to be on camera, feel free to turn your camera off. If you're able to, please use the chat box to send in questions, or you can raise your virtual hand if you'd rather ask your question out loud. I do ask to save most of your questions till the end. There will be a Q&A portion. Throughout the session, please attend to your needs, stretch, go to the bathroom, eat a snack, etc. Help me help you, and that means in the chat, you can tell me to slow down, speak up, repeat, or rephrase. And if for some reason I missed that in the chat, Holly or Tafaz would just say that out loud and I'll respond accordingly. Be considerate, kind, constructive, and helpful. Avoid demeaning, discriminatory, harassing, hateful, or threatening behavior, speech, and imagery. And just a note on this point, if we see that in the chat, we will remove you right away, no questions asked. If you're not sure, ask someone instead of assuming. So thank you in advance for championing these principles. And with that, I'll now go over in terms of what to expect for this training. So here's the pop. The purpose for today is to learn and share about choice points, how choice points impacts our campaigns. And the outcome will be that you'll understand Some of Us's approach to campaigning using choice points from an anti-oppression lens. And the process will look like the community guidelines that I just went over on the previous slide. Us talking a bit about oppression and anti-oppression. We'll then talk about how that intersects with corporate power. We'll do a quick break. And then after that, we'll talk about choice points, bringing it all together, and we'll end with a Q&A. So before we share the practices we use here at Some of Us to ensure that we're running campaigns from an anti-O lens, we first need to talk about oppression and anti-oppression. So I'm going to kick off this training by inviting you all to share in the chat, what definitions have you heard of oppression and anti-oppression? And of course, if you see a definition that someone shares in the chat that you like, feel free to affirm that with a +1 spot on, or of your choosing. So what definitions have you heard for the word oppression and anti-oppression? So Erica said oppression is upholding white supremacy ideals by leaving out or tokenizing marginalized community. Yes. We have another response that says oppression is when someone or something powerful suppresses the power of others, certainly. And anti-oppression is being actively against oppressive practices. And I'll do one more and I'll share my screen. Oppression is the economic, social, political, or structural subjugation of one group by another. Definitely, those are great definitions of oppression for sure. And as we continue through the chat, like Holly will populate that in the presentation. So when it comes to oppression, when we talk about that as Some of Us, we're defining it as such. The systems, policies, and norms, explicit and implicit, that create inequality amongst people, often based on our identities. Oppression happens internally, interpersonally, and institutionally and structurally. The key thing to remember when it comes to oppression is that it's rooted in domination, exploitation, and extraction. So I would love to hear from you all now. What are some examples of oppression we encounter on an everyday basis? Or if it's not an everyday basis, often? Voting laws, yes, it's a really good one, Erica, for sure. Can I get one or two more immigration laws? Yes, Anna. General behavior towards immigrants, yes, that's absolutely correct, Marina. Unequal access to jobs, yes, keep suggesting those examples in the chat. They're very much spot on. And I'm just gonna throw out a couple more as well. Gender-based discrimination at work, racist misogynistic ads. Yes, I see city planning, police harassment, brutality amongst minorities. Yes, these are all really good examples of the oppressions that we may be encountering either often or in our daily lives right now. When we talk about anti-oppression, this is what we mean by that. Anti-oppression work seeks to recognize the oppression that exists in our society and attempts to mitigate its effects and eventually equalize the power imbalance in our communities. So similar to on the previous slide where I asked, what are examples of oppression you encounter on a daily basis? I'm now gonna ask, what are some examples of anti-oppression, also known as anti-O, because I will be saying anti-O for the rest of the training, since anti-oppression could be really long sometimes, we encounter on an everyday basis. Providing translation in meetings, yes. Allyship. I'll do one more and then I can list some of my examples. Inclusion initiatives, yes. Some other examples, equity programs, such as like affirmative action policies. And if you live in a city or a state that might have expanded high quality access to universal pre-K for low-income families, that is a real life tangible example of what another like anti-O looks like in practice. Okay, so you may be wondering, what does oppression and anti-oppression have to do with this training and the work that we do at Some of Us? Well, the thing is, like, we can all agree for the most part that everything in life is connected. And so here at Some of Us, fighting for a world where people come before profit, where everyone can thrive, means that we're holding corporations accountable for the role they play in reinforcing oppression. So we're gonna take it a bit further now. We're gonna talk about corporate power and how it plays out in the world. So before I do that, let's define corporate power. Corporate power is a system of oppressions benefiting corporations. Corporate campaigns with anti-O framings aim to shift power to those who are oppressed. In other words, corporate power is a system of personal, positional, institutional oppression benefiting corporations and private interest. So how does that show up in the world at large? First and foremost, here are some examples. Corporations command enormous wealth, and many of them are richer than nations. For this, the first company that comes to mind is Apple. Corporations use lobbying to push through laws that benefit them. If you're joining from California, or if you're just like actively involved in politics, et cetera, you may be familiar with that law, that Prop 22, that allowed a lot of companies like Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, et cetera, to make it where their workers were excluded from nearly all employee rights under the state law, including rights to minimum wage, time and a half, for overtime expenses, reimbursements, and benefits. So that's like a prime example of that. And with the last one, corporations can own and control strategic areas such as information, medias, social platforms, or health, medical, RDV platforms in France. The one that comes to mind for me, being based in the US, if you think about it, and everybody knows this, Facebook. So those are some examples of how corporate power shows up in the world, right? So to put it another way, like I said before, corporations can create, reinforce, and even perpetuate systems of oppression. So when we say that corporations reinforce, perpetuate systems of oppressions, this is what we mean. If you look at the slide, you see a couple of themes like listed out. Forced labor. Right now, a lot of major fashion brands are complicit in the reinforcement of forced labor that has happened at the hands of the government of China to the Uyghurs, right? Authoritarian regimes, you think about the recent coup in Myanmar, companies like Total and Chevron that are still actively operating in that country, therefore funding the current coup that's happening right now. Occupation and colonial regime, corporations, for example, they'll steal people's resources, water and land, Pipeline 3, that active fight right now. And also they take part in violating a lot of indigenous rights. I see some folks are also suggesting things in the chat as well. Yes, for sure. So these are some examples of how corporations can create, reinforce, and perpetuate systems of oppression. And that is why at Some of Us, we made that conscious decision to run corporate campaigns that center anti-O and aim to shift that balance over time. So I'll be going into more detail about what that looks like for us. So choice points. As I mentioned earlier, here at Some of Us, we're committed to ensuring that our campaigns are rooted in anti-O. And to ensure that this is happening, we utilize a framework known as choice points. Before I tell you more about this framework, I first want to acknowledge and give a shout out to the racial equity org known as Race Forward, who created this framework. And since we've been introduced to it at Some of Us, we've adopted and adapted the tool to look at our org and our work in the world, and encourage you all to do the same if you find this useful. So what is choice points? Well, choice points are opportunities to reflect, generate options, and act on decisions that can impact racial equity and inclusion and help us practice anti-oppression. Choice points is a tool, and it helps us put our values about equity into our action and into our campaigns. Using this framework also gives us the opportunity to reflect, generate options, and act on decisions that can impact equity and inclusion. So in other words, to put that very simple and break it down where if you have kids, they'll really understand it right now. There is no neutral path. No decision is a decision. So if you look at this image right now that's on your screen, you'll see, if you picture like you're standing on like a railroad track, you have two paths. On the left is a path where it's like filled with autopilot. When you're operating from autopilot, that basically means you may not necessarily be thinking about the impacts that your decisions may be having on the most marginalized and most vulnerable people in your community or in the work that you do. And when that happens, it leads to decisions that are made with like the status quo. Like those results are often include inequity, exclusion, and oppression. But if before you make major decisions, you're thinking about the impact that those decisions can have on the most marginalized people, then that will mean that you have on the right, where it says intentional choice, you have more equitable and inclusive practices. And that leads to more equitable outcomes, i.e. if you're a person at an organization with a lot of power and you have control over some of the policies that your companies create, when you use choice points to think about how said policies may impact your BIPOC people on staff, and when I say BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, that means your policies have more equity in them. And the BIPOC people on staff will feel like they're being heard and they're being seen, and you're being more inclusive. So that's another way to think about like this chart. It's like if you're at, like I said, the intersection of a railroad track, on the left is what you usually do, status quo, things have always been that way, so there's no need to change it. Where on the right is an opportunity, choice points, to really think about the effects of your decisions and how we may be able to mitigate against the effects of those. And now I would love to hear from you all in the chat, looking at your work or activism life. What are some of the decisions that you make or participate in that directly affect other people or communities? And similar to the previous slides, your responses will populate those on the post-it notes. So looking at your work or activism life, what are some of the decisions that you make or participate in that directly affect other people or communities? Reach and improvement, yes. Course content, yes, spot on. How to include communities when working on campaign strategy, yes. Training activists in gender equality, yes. These are really good examples of that. And I'll say as well, like for example, if you're a funder, right? Like you can also use choice points to think about which groups you're funding to and the resources that you're providing for them. And similar in educator, you can help use choice points to figure out like, you know, what lessons do you teach or how you talk about a particular thing. Community activism, yes. The accessibility of venues we use, yes, that's a really good one. And if we pay to provide translation in what languages, yes, these are really good examples that you all are suggesting right now, and real life experiences, I should say, of how choice point, yes. Choice points, choice of pictures and the narratives they convey, yes, for sure. So keep suggesting more like in the chat, and like I said, we'll populate those in the post-it notes as well. Now I'm gonna talk about choice points and practice and the work that we do here at Some of Us. As of right now, you kind of have an abstract idea of what choice points is, what it looks like, and how you may unknowingly be using it in your everyday life. So with that in mind, I'm now going to talk about what it looks like in our work. And to do so, I'm going to go over some questions that we as campaigners at Some of Us ask ourselves at the very beginning of our campaign research. First question we ask ourselves when it comes to doing the prep is, which topics do you choose? Which criteria do you use? Which sources do you use to find them? Which other sources could you use? So prep questions like these help to ensure that we're not just doing things or doing our research, I should say, on autopilot and forces us to make sure that we're making informed decisions related to our campaign research. So once you kind of answer those questions when it comes to the very beginning of like the early like campaign stages, then we're going to shift into storytelling, right? Which is, what's your angle? Is there an anti-O angle that you can include even if it's not your main angle? Which language should you use or not use? When should you include a content warning? And is your framing or narrative empowering? Because the truth of the matter is, as organizers, how you tell the story is important. These questions allow us to ensure that we're telling stories that empower and center the most marginalized. So once you figured out the story you want to tell your members or your audience, let's talk about visual content. If you're a graphic designer, this part is for you in particular. When it comes to images, is it an accurate depiction of the issue? Is it representative of diverse races, ages, genders, abilities, and other diversities? Does the photo or video show a point of view that's dehumanizing? For example, a photo that shows only a woman's torso with no head in the frame. An image can speak 1,000 words, and in this digital age, you want to make sure we're making informed, equitable choices when it comes to the images that we use. And when it comes to the visual content, there's more on this. Does it or does it not reinforce stereotypes or dominant culture stories about marginalized people? Are marginalized groups affected by the issues adequately represented? So now we're going to break this down even more. We've defined choice points, we explain what it is in theory, but if you're like me and you need real life examples to better understand things, we're going to use one of our campaigns right now to show you how that looks like in practice. And the campaign we're going to talk about is our palm oil campaign. When it comes to palm oil, for those that may not be familiar, palm oil is an edible vegetable oil that comes from the fruit of oil palm trees. Given its versatility, palm oil is basically used in everything: hair products, snacks, etc. So on this slide, you see a bit more like extra background when it comes to palm oil. Palm oil is produced mostly by POCs, i.e. people of color. 86% of it is produced in Indonesia and Malaysia. In Indonesia only, upwards of 25 million people depend on palm oil for their livelihood. The other thing to know about palm oil is that oil palm trees are 6 to 10 times more efficient at producing oil than crops such as soybean, olive, and sunflower. That is why we made the conscious decision, that's a choice point, to never call for a boycott of palm oil. Why? Because doing so would cause more harm than good, given the fact that on the previous slide, we said that 25 plus million people depend on palm oil to care for themselves and their loved ones. Now, if you've probably heard of palm oil before, then you know oftentimes when we talk about it, that palm oil is a climate issue. And most of the focus on the rainforest and the orangutans. But what about displaced communities, land rights, workers' rights, or migrant rights? In the PepsiCo campaign, we made the conscious decision, that's a choice point, to center the stories of workers exploited on palm oil plantations. And the next slide will talk about why we did that. Solely focusing on cute orangutans and devastated ecosystems, of course, would have been more engaging to our list and to our members, but it would have worsened the invisibilization of the workers and the dehumanization of people of color. So all along the way, we checked with partners, and through them and partners on the ground, we made conscious decisions to not move forward with the tactic unless it was approved, nor did we call victory on this campaign until affected partners called a victory. That's a choice point. So I'm going to go in more detail about why that is and why that happened. First things first, when we spoke to partners on the ground and partners that we worked with, they wanted us to focus on the workers and on the people. And during those 5 years, we succeeded to get at least one win per year, resulting in always stronger policies from Pepsi, but we didn't stop there because these wins were making enough impact for people concerned on the ground. So we were waiting for them to call a win before we declared it as a win. In terms of when it came to our partners, we decided to work closely with the Rain Action Network because we were certain that they were directly working with concerned people. So the real win for this campaign was for the fact that when Pepsi announced this new policy, it took into consideration the impact when it comes to palm oil, not just on the planet, but the environment and the people, and it adopted in consultation with and was approved by the workers union. So that is a real life case study for us of how we've utilized choice points in one of our successful and popular campaigns. So you're about to hear about a campaign that we recently won in France, but instead of me talking to you all about this campaign, you're going to hear directly from the campaigner that ran this campaign. So in the video, Ibrahim will discuss the campaign, what led him to launching and running it, and the decisions that were made. So before Tafasa press play, this is just a flag that this video is not professionally done. So it does get a bit shaky at times. So if you're really sensitive and you get motion sickness, feel free to just like read or just like listen to the caption. Just listen to the audio. That's totally fine. And there is a bit of a background noise. So if it becomes very distracting, you can just listen to the audio on low, and closed captioning is provided with that video. So as you're listening, just take notes of where you believe choice points are being used. And I'll talk about what's going to happen next once the video stops playing. So Tafatwa, if you can start it now.
Hey everyone, my name is Ibrahim Beshori. I'm a digital campaigner for Some of Us. I started working for Some of Us in January of this year, 2021, and I've been working here for 6 months. And today I'm going to talk to you about my first campaign and maybe what is my favorite campaign, the campaign against the Accor Group and against Ibis Hotel, who were mistreating their workers. So a bit of background on this campaign. Ibis workers were mostly BIPOC women, mostly Black women, were constantly mistreated, but also underpaid by the Ibis Hotel. They took advantage, Ibis Hotel and the Accor Group took advantage of the fact that these women were immigrants for most of them, didn't think they could protest. Didn't think also that they could challenge their work condition, and also they took advantage of the fact that some of them couldn't read their paychecks and couldn't read their contracts to treat them in the worst possible way, but also to constantly mistreat them and get away with it. One of these women, Rachel, realized that the situation was unfair and reached out to the union, the CGT HPE. And reach out to a specific organizer, Tiziri Kandi, who is also a BIPOC woman, to work on that specific campaign. They started to organize in 2019, shortly before the coronavirus crisis started. And they kept on building a movement that challenged the practices that they were facing, but without success, unfortunately, because the Ibis Hotel and the Accor Group was constantly ignoring them. Fast forward to January 2021, I joined the French team of Some of Us. I'm hired in November, but I joined in January. And the French team had been wanting to work on that for a long time, but didn't have the capacity to do so, didn't have time to do so. And they asked me when I joined the team if I wanted to make that my first campaign. And myself being a North African man, a Muslim North African man living in France, accepted immediately to go on this campaign because it touched me personally. I could feel like a connection with the plight of this woman that in a lot of ways looked like my mom, were like my mom, and had similar professions that my mom could have as an immigrant that came from Morocco to France if she had worked. So I started working on it, and what I did is that I did a lot of research to not go and just come and not be prepared to what they were saying. I did a lot of research about the issue, about the possibilities for them, about also what they were saying, and that was the most important thing. I wanted to understand what they were saying. I wanted to understand their plight, and then I went to them and I asked them. I reached out to get to them. I reached out to BIPOC activists that I know and that had connections with them, and I got in connection with Tiziri and later on with Rachel, and asked them what they wanted. How could we, at Some of Us, help them to do what they wanted to do? So I crafted a petition according to their will. They asked me to craft the petition by sharing their stories, and I did so. They asked me to share the petition at a specific time, and I did it when they asked me to do so. And they asked me also to not mention any connection with them, because they wanted our petition, our digital organizing, to come as something that emerged organically. They didn't want Accor or Ibis to think that it was another organizing effort from the union. And so we kept on building in this way. and we managed to progressively make Accor scared of us. Right after we sent the petition, right after we sent an email to Accor to also tell them that we were launching the petition, they went to see this woman at the meeting, and they asked, like, what was happening, did they know us, were they in contact with us, because what we were doing was worrisome. And this woman said that, like, we had no contacts whatsoever, and that they couldn't, like, stop what we were doing. The negotiations between Accor, Ibis, and this woman have been in a stalemate. But after we launched the petition, it built some pressure that made the campaign move forward, and they started negotiating more seriously with this woman. And afterwards, I also reached to some BIPOC influencers and asked them to share the petition, to share the campaign, to share the plight of this woman, which brought like an extra 5,000 or more signatures in a couple of days, which I think really made Accor worry about what was happening. After that, we launched the campaign in English, and we said that we were going to launch it in Spanish and in German too. And I think that was the breaking point for them. And they decided to negotiate really seriously with this woman, who at the end of the day obtained most of what they wanted: better work conditions and better salaries too. So that was a huge win. That was a huge privilege for me to be part of this campaign. And it was amazing to see, like, how by listening to people who were directly affected by an issue, you can actually craft a really strong campaign. Thank you for listening. So now it's your turn. You have been trained a few minutes ago to identify choice points, and I want you to identify what are the choice points that I used in this campaign. I don't know how much time you have to do so, but like, good luck with it. All right, take care.
Okay, so you all have just heard from Ibrahim about the campaign. And before we break you all into breakout groups, we're just going to go over a couple of instructions. We're also going to drop a Google document in the chat that you all should be able to access to, with a bit more background information about the campaign and discussion prompts. So in your breakout groups, the first things first, introduce yourselves, share your name, your pronouns if you're comfortable, if that's really important for you to share, and where you're participating from. Choose a facilitator, a timekeeper, and someone to report back to the main group. And you'll see some like descriptions, what to expect for each role. Facilitator, your role is just to make sure that everyone understands the instructions and has a chance to contribute to the discussion and keeping the group in a safe place. Timekeeper's role, solely to just keep track of time to ensure that your group is moving through the questions efficiently. Spokesperson's role, you were the person that will summarize to the main group what was discussed in your group, i.e. the places that you believe that choice points are being used. And the third thing is to discuss the campaign using the prompts as a guide. Okay, so now we're going to move into the sharing portion, which I'm going to give you all the opportunity to share some of the examples that you came up with in terms of where decisions that Ibrahim made in his campaign. Once you've done this portion, I'll then obviously go over some of the examples, I should say some of the choice points decisions that Ibrahim made and talk about the impacts of those. But first, we'll definitely like to hear from one or two of you all about the choice points places that you identified. And so I don't know who's in what group. So how I'm going to do this right now is I'll just ask out loud who's in a certain group, and Holly to Foster just like let me know if that person does some kind of indication on the screen, and we can either have them share it in the chat or if you can say it out loud. Got it, Jindira. Okay. So if you were in group 3, who is the spokesperson for your group? And if you're the spokesperson, in the interest of time, so I can make sure that more people have the opportunity to like actually share their thoughts as well, just choose one place where your group identified that Ibrahim utilized choice points. So group 3.
So one choice point that we identified was the organizers allowed or honored workers' requests to not disclose that they were working with a third-party organization. So that they could remain more safe.
Yes, that is for sure in an area in which Ibrahim utilized choice points. Thank you, Lauren.
We spent most of our chat actually rehashing what the video was because one of our group members wasn't able to listen to the video. But the two things we did discuss was one, that there was a choice point in what we understood to be the decision to have a petition, that the group actually asked him to create a petition, and that they also were heavily involved, the BIPOC women, in creating the content of the petition. So the fact that so much decision-making power there was handed over to the women affected. And then we also just had a little bit of a conversation about how maybe Ibrahim's positionality was quite important as an empowering effect, that he was North African, that he saw his mother somewhat reflected in these women, and that maybe created a different kind of allyship.
Yes, thank you, Juliana. But I wanted to speak to something that Juliana raised, in which would also like tie into something as well, which is, of course, in some cases with campaigns, you may not necessarily have a personal like relationship with the group that you're trying to partner with. However, the example that Juliana highlighted, though, was that Ibrahim allowed the workers to have control over the story that was being told. And that is where you can utilize choice points. So you may not necessarily need to have that personal connection with the group. It may not be the case throughout life, of course, but you can allow that whatever group you're partnering with to have ownership of the way in which you're telling that story, because you want to make sure that they feel empowered as well. Since it's them that are actually being impacted by this thing. We're going to talk about the choice points decisions that Ibrahim actually made in this campaign. Of course, there's more, but in the interest of time, these are the top 4 that I wanted to speak to about. So the first things first, his research focused on understanding the specific multi-layered issues of this campaign and how it intersected with race, class, and gender. That was an area in which choice points was definitely used. Also by reaching out to the women leading the strike to strategize, right? Because it could have been very easy for us to just say, oh, this is a really cool issue. We want all the press about this thing. Let's ignore the fact that, these workers are actually like being impacted by this thing. But instead, he decided to reach out to the women leading the strike to strategize and best figure out how we can help. The other thing was that we proactively sought the content approval from the strikers to ensure accuracy and that their story was being told in an empowering way. And the last thing that happened was that we reached out to the BIPOC media influencers to help the campaign reach a new audience on in the social media ethers. So let's talk about the impact of that. So new ties with the strikers were formed, which will lead to other potential campaigns. It also means that support and recognition from BIPOC orgs and social media influencers who identified some of us as a respectful and supportive organization. We had a powerful and liberatory narrative that Accord, Ibis, Accord Invest, there's a reason why I put the definition of what these 3 groups are, because it could be slightly confusing, but because we made them see, right, that we were the alternative, compromising or negotiating directly with these strikers was better than us actually having to go full-fledged with this campaign and them getting all the bad publicity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those are some of the impacts of the fact that when it comes to Ibrahim using choice points in his campaign. So I'm going to sum this up in a very, hopefully, nice package way by going over some key learnings. So if you're a processor like me, I know we've covered a lot of information related to choice points. So the next few slides will break this down in a more digestible bit. So the first thing you want to do, right, is know your desired outcome. When it comes to choice points, you'd always think about, like I said, your desired outcome. And for this campaign, 2 of our desired outcomes were that workers would get their demands met and that we would have a strong working relationship with this union. Once you know your desired outcome and you're thinking about what the end results you want to achieve, you then want to pause and identify decision-making opportunities, choice points that might have equity and inclusion impacts. So some of the things you want to be thinking about is what decisions do you regularly make and what is your default path or autopilot choice? So we went through this a few minutes ago, right? But some of those choice points opportunities in the Beast campaign was reaching out to the strikers and having them take the lead, reaching out to the BIPOC activists to help them spread the word. But that's to also ensure that our campaign was being seen in a diverse place. The next thing you want to do is examine the choice points and their potential impact on equity and inclusion. So thinking about in what ways could your default path lead to unintended impacts on those on the margins. Once you've done that, you then want to brainstorm alternative options. And forgive me for not saying this up front, we are going to share this presentation, so you have the chance to actually see this and review it on your own as well. So yes, once you've done, you've examined your choice points and potential impact on equity and inclusion, we're going to do the brainstorming alternative options. And for that, you're thinking about what are your other options? So after you've done the brainstorm of your alternative options to your default approach, you then act and evaluate. So in this step, you're reflecting on whether your choice points could lead to your desired outcomes or your desired results, and what was the impact on equity and inclusion. So this is just another way, like this slide right here, is just like another way to lay that out. So if this were your campaign, essentially each circle on this dot is an opportunity to reflect. So before you launch your campaign, you would do extensive research on the issue to get a more holistic view. And that's where those like prep questions that I introduced earlier in the presentation will come into handy. And then as your campaign progresses, then it's important to have, reflection points where you're stepping back and examining your decisions through an equity lens using choice points. Then based on the answers coming out of that step back, then you review and update your campaign accordingly. And then you repeat, and repeat, just to make sure that you're constantly thinking about choice points and the equity aspects of your campaign. With that, and before I go into the Q&A portion, I invite you all to think about one thing you learned, one thing you're curious about, and one thing you will take with you immediately. You don't have to share this if you don't want to, but if you like, you feel free to share that in the chat. And with that, I'm going to shift into the Q&A portion of this training, and we'll do that for about hopefully 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how many questions we have, before we wrap up. Actually, Holly or Tafas, you can just also, just for the sake of time, we're gonna also, if it's ideal, like complete a survey, just let us know how we did. This was a training we put together in honor for our 10-year anniversary. So it'd be good to get some feedback in terms of like how you all found this training as well. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, and then we can move into the Q&A portion. Let's see. I actually am going to read some of the things you've learned. I've learned about some of us and curious to know more, and I'm taking away the choice point and the choice points to adopt anti-O in my campaigns. Yes, you succeeded with that. Awesome. Having the framework informed by anti-O values and lexicon of choice points is one thing I learned and one thing I can take away and use immediately. Awesome. This is like warming my heart. Thank you all. Okay, so I'm gonna, like I said, this is now your time. If you have any questions, feel free to ask those in the chat, or we can invite you to come off mute and just ask your question out loud. And for those that I can't necessarily answer off the top of my head, I'll just like take a look at them, reflect on them, and we can send responses back to you all like via email.
Down. So you're going to get this survey in an email as well. And while we can't take advantage of your energy at this moment, so please remember your feedback because we really value it.
Wow. Okay. It happens. It happens. Right. The joy of technology. And thank you all for your patience and having us being comfortable showing our mess, because these things happen, and like rolling with us on that. Well, if there aren't any questions right now, I'm going to close by saying this. Thank you so much for spending most of your Saturday with us. And for those that may be in a different time zone, I guess like your early Sunday morning. Okay, there is a question coming in through Erica. Give me 1 second. I'm thinking the human versus superreacting campaign. And then comparing
it out loud while you spend a second thinking about it. So
thank you, Champ. Thank you, thank you.
So I'm thinking, Erica, I'm thinking of the human versus orangutan example and comparing it to some of the children-centered fundraising campaigns for nonprofit organizations. Can you talk about the ways in which you can run human-centered campaigns without exploiting people? Toni.
That's me. Okay, I'm gonna do my best to tackle this on the fly. Yes, so I think this is part of where choice points would come into play, right? For sure, you don't want to exploit people. And I think if you're a campaigner, when you're doing your research, you want to make sure that you can also reach out to people that may know more about an issue, and you can check in with them to see like, hey, we want to say this. How does this language particular sound? Like, how does this language sound? How would it be received? Because you're thinking about all those aspects of it. So I'll say, to run those human-centered campaigns, yes, it's a tricky balance of making sure you're talking about the issue, but if you're leaning more towards like, actually, let me back up and rephrase that. First things first you want to do, as you're researching, if you notice you don't know something or more about a particular thing, reach out to find out who else might actually know something. Who are the experts on the ground or experts you can talk to? Then have them suggest to you people that may be directly impacted by said issue and reach out to them for advice in terms of messaging, crafting, etc. That will be like a basic step that you should be doing, like as a campaigner, just anyone actually, if you're in a position of power. And then from there, I think if you utilize the choice points frameworks, like really think about the effects of your decision making, it can help to figure out like if you're striking that balance between making sure you're telling the story in a very empowering way without exploiting the impacts that people are having. That's off the top of my head, I guess, like what I'm thinking right now, but if I think of anything else, then I can of course like include that in my response when we send that out. So I'm hoping that made a bit sense. I'm sorry, it's like top of my head with that. Were there any more?
Was there a difference of opinion between people on the ground, so protecting local forest-based livelihoods versus protecting workers' rights of those on palm oil plantations? And if so, how did you navigate them in an anti-O way?
So that is a good question that I fully can't speak to because I'm not the campaigner that run this, but Holly, what I can do is I can take this question to the campaigner that did FATA and have him answer that question. We can send that out as well. Because obviously these things are going to happen, but let me just read this question one more time to see if I can actually speak to something with it. Okay, so the other thing I will add is with the PepsiCo campaign, in the previous slides, like all the way up in terms of like choice points in practice, one of the things that we also did was we also spoke to like the union that represented these workers. And so those workers like actually made the request to like center their stories in the campaign as well. So like, of course, there are probably like more nuances of that and I can follow up with the campaigner directly to get more details around it. But I'll say that was like one of the things we tried to do to like help navigate like those concerns because there's always gonna be tension as an organizer. And of course, like knowing how to navigate that can sometimes be challenging, but part of it is, I think, it's also asking up front, how can we help? And then if it aligns with, you know, what you're trying to do, and then you rally, you can figure out the best way in which you can all come to like an understanding and a compromise on that. Okay, Juliana, I see your question. Okay, so Juliana said, I'm also curious about the point you made at the beginning, including anti-O angle, even if it's not your main angle. Do you have some reflections on tokenism and how to substantively include anti-O work, even if it's not your main angle? So I can speak to like a certain aspect of your question, Juliana. So yes, when I say that, if I'm just gonna go with the campaigner organizer example because that's the field that I work in. So there could be times where the issue that you're working on, your list or your membership may not be all the way familiar with the ways in which it impacts marginalized communities or how it intersects with other issues. And so when I say like to use anti-O, but even if it's not your main angle, it just means that you're basically sprinkling little bits of that story throughout the mailings that you're sharing, like with your membership, or how you're talking about a particular issue to your membership. Because the end goal would be over time, indirectly or subconsciously, like you're helping your membership or your list. In this case, we predominantly send our, we get our campaigns out via email. We're educating our members on a particular issue. So for example, let's see, what's a good example? Oh yes, we'll just use palm oil, right? Because I mentioned that predominantly when folks talk about palm oil, it's usually the effect that it has on the like the ecosystems and the orangutans. But what we started to do in our mail-ins was to also, like I said, talk about the impacts that this has on the workers. So then when a person's reading this mail-in, it's like, oh, I never thought about that before. And then with each mail, you can add on to that. And like you're basically bringing your members along on that anti-O journey. So it may not necessarily be depending on like your organization and how you talk about and the issues that you work on. Your list or your membership may not be all the way familiar or fully have that anti-O muscle to think about the ways in which everything intersects. But what you can do is be intentional about the messaging that you're sharing in your conversations or like in your mail-ins to your list, so that over time you can start to be even more explicit with the ways in which these issues intersect. So I hope that helps. I'll do one more question if there are any more in the chat. I'm just scrolling up to see if we missed any. Yes, like anti-O is a muscle. Here at Some of Us, we don't expect everyone coming in, for example, to be an expert at anti-O. It's like, I would not consider myself to be an expert in anti-O. Like, you constantly have to learn, you're constantly evolving and like growing it's a muscle, like you're building that muscle, and you're definitely like, as you grow, as you read more, you understand more and how things like intersect. So that's a good way to think about it for sure, is that anti-O is a muscle. And depending on where you are on your journey, it just means that you may necessarily have like to do more reading or like, but over time, like you will get there. And so would like your membership and your list for sure. I am going to close out the Q&A portion. Since there doesn't seem to be any more questions right now. Thank you for spending time on your Saturday or your Sunday mornings with us in community to learn about how we run inclusive campaigns here at Some of Us. When SurveyMonkey decides to be your friend again, we will send out the survey link. So please, if it's useful, like write down your feedback somewhere where you can like remember what to share when the site is up again. And yes, thank you all once again for being in community with us. We hope this training was really beneficial, and we really hope that you can take or adapt the Choice Points framework and apply it to your work or in your personal lives as well. So with that, have a great rest of your days, evenings, or mornings, everyone.